There is a photograph, cracked faintly along one corner, of a man standing on the deck of a small government yacht called the SY Ivy. He wears coral, hundreds of strands of red and pink beads wrapped around his neck, his wrists, his ankles, the kind of regalia that for centuries only a king of Benin was allowed to touch. Two armed guards flank him. The year is 1897, and the yacht is moving east along the coast, away from Benin City, toward a small colonial outpost called Calabar. His name is Ovonramwen Nogbaisi, the 35th Oba of Benin, and though no one on that deck says it out loud, everyone standing there already knows he will never rule again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is not the country that carries the name Benin today, the one further west along the coast once known as Dahomey. This is an older kingdom, one that rose out of the rainforest of what is now southern Nigeria, ruled from a walled capital called Benin City by an unbroken line of kings, or Obas, stretching back to the 12th century. For nearly 700 years that kingdom built palaces, cast bronze plaques that hung in their thousands on the palace walls, and fielded armies no neighboring power could match. Then, in a matter of weeks in early 1897, most of it came apart. This is the story of what happened to that royal family once its kingdom fell, and it does not end in 1897. Parts of it are still being written today, in courtrooms and museum storerooms on 3 different continents. Before the Obas, the Edo people were ruled by a dynasty called the Ogiso, the Kings of the Sky, who governed a loose collection of settlements known as Igodomi-Godo. That dynasty ended sometime around the 12th century, and according to the oral history still recited in Benin City, the Edo chiefs sent to the neighboring kingdom of Ife for a prince to rule them. That prince's son, Eweka, became the first Oba, founding a dynasty that would rule without interruption, save for one 17-year gap forced on it by the British, all the way to the present day. The kingdom's real transformation came under Oba Ewuare, who took the throne around 1440 after a war that burned much of the old capital down. Ewuare rebuilt the city, dug a moat roughly 50 feet deep around the palace, and raised an earthen wall that eventually stretched for miles through the surrounding forest, among the largest man-made boundaries built anywhere before the machine age. He organized craftsmen into guilds, one for ivory carvers, one for blacksmiths, one for the brass casters who would go on to produce the plaques and heads that made Benin famous well beyond West Africa. In 1485, near the end of his reign, Portuguese ships reached the coast. Trade followed, pepper and ivory and palm oil exchanged for cloth, coral, and firearms. Later, Obas used that wealth to push the kingdom's borders west into Yoruba territory and east across the Niger, until Benin stood as one of the most organized states in the region, with its own bureaucracy of palace chiefs, its own calendar of royal rituals, and its own standing army. The bronze and brass work at the center of this story was never made for export or sale. Each plaque, each commemorative head, was cast for the palace altars, meant to record the reign of a particular Oba or honor his mother, the Ioba, a title created in the 16th century for Idia, whose war strategy helped her son Esegie hold the throne against his own brother. These objects lived inside the palace walls. They were not art in the sense a European gallery would use that word. They were memory, cast in metal, meant to stay exactly where they were placed. That world held together for roughly 400 years, weakened at points by succession disputes and by the slow decline of the Atlantic slave trade the kingdom had once profited from, but never broken. By the time Ovonramwen took the throne in 1888, Benin remained one of the last African kingdoms still governing itself, still setting its own terms of trade, in a region where nearly everything around it had already been folded into a European colonial map. That independence was exactly what troubled the British trading firms working the coast. Ovonramwen kept a personal monopoly over goods like ivory and rubber, a practice those firms found bad for business and worse for their margins. In 1892, a British vice-consul named Henry Galway pressured him into signing a treaty that, in the vague language typical of such documents, appeared to place Benin under British protection. Ovonramwen seems not to have understood it that way, and for the next 5 years he continued ruling much as he always had. The break came at the start of 1897. James Robert Phillips, the acting consul general for the region, decided to march on Benin City with an armed column disguised as a trading mission, its weapons hidden inside the porter's loads. Ovonramwen sent word asking him to wait, since the timing collided with a religious festival during which the Oba was forbidden from receiving outsiders. Phillips pressed on regardless. On the 4th of January, his column was ambushed near a village called Ugbin by Benin soldiers acting on the orders of the kingdom's military commander. Phillips and all but 2 of the British members of his party were killed. London called it the Benin Massacre and used it as the pretext it had been looking for. Within 8 days, the Admiralty had assembled a force of 1,200 men under Rear Admiral Harry Rawson. They landed in early February and reached Benin City inside 2 weeks, burning much of it as they advanced. What they found inside the royal compound stopped several of the invading officers in their tracks. Room after room of cast bronze and brass, carved ivory tusks and masks, coral regalia, thousands of individual objects accumulated on those altars over 4 centuries. The palace was set alight, whether by British shelling or by defenders unwilling to let it fall intact, is still argued over. Officers were permitted, in some cases openly encouraged, to take pieces home to offset the cost of the campaign. Within a few years, fragments of the Benin court were sitting in auction houses in London and museum cases in Berlin, Vienna, and Hamburg. Ovonramwen fled into the forest and evaded capture for 6 months. He returned to formally surrender on the 5th of August, dressed in full coral regalia and accompanied by an entourage of 700 or 800 people, as though determined to make his surrender as much a statement as his coronation had once been. The British held standing orders to hang him. Consul General Ralph Moore chose exile instead, a decision historians still argue over, since it left Ovonramwen alive but permanently stripped of his throne and his city. Before he was taken away, he reportedly offered Moore 200 barrels of palm oil and the location of 500 buried ivory tusks in exchange for staying. Moore turned him down. He had already found the tusks. Ovonramwen was placed aboard the SY Ivy and taken to Calabar, a colonial administrative town several hundred miles east of Benin City, along with 2 of his wives, Queen Egbe and Queen Aigobahi. He was given a modest house, a small government allowance, and told he would remain there under British supervision for the rest of his life. Benin City itself was placed under a British resident and administered without an Oba for the first time in roughly 700 years. A senior chief named Ago Obaseki managed local affairs during the interregnum, careful never to claim the throne outright, since in the eyes of the Edo people it belonged to the bloodline and to no one else. For 17 years, Ovonramwen lived in Calabar as a private citizen with a king's memory and no kingdom. Visitors described him as dignified and watchful, still addressed by his household with the honorifics of a reigning Oba, even though the colonial government refused to recognize him as one. He continued to receive occasional gifts sent quietly from Edo chiefs loyal to the old order, small tokens meant to remind him, and perhaps themselves, that the throne had been vacated rather than abolished. He died there around the turn of 1914, not quite 60 by most estimates, and was eventually returned to Benin City for burial on the grounds of the palace that had once been his. His death set the interregnum's end in motion. Within months, the British colonial administration, weighing the practical benefits of ruling through an established local authority against the political risk of a fully independent monarchy, agreed to let his son take the throne. On the 24th of July 1914, a man born Oba Ovonramwen was crowned and took the name Eweka II, deliberately invoking the dynasty's original founder to signal that the line had been interrupted rather than broken. What Eweka II inherited was a shell of what his father had ruled. The palace lay in ruins. Most of its ceremonial bronzes and ivories were gone, scattered across museums and private collections in Britain, Germany, Austria, and the United States, bought by institutions that in many cases had little idea what they were acquiring, beyond the fact that it was rare, and by the taste of the period, extraordinary. Eweka spent his 19 years on the throne rebuilding what he could. He restored the craft guilds his ancestors had organized centuries before, founded a school to keep the old casting techniques alive, and negotiated the return of his father's coral crown and beaded garment, on loan to a British collector's family, and finally handed back in the 1930s. It was a fraction of what had been lost. It was also something, and it set a pattern his descendants would spend the rest of the century trying to build on. Eweka II died in February 1933 and was succeeded by his son, who took the name Akenzua II. Akenzua had been educated in colonial schools and understood, in a way his father's generation had not fully grasped, that the objects taken in 1897 were not simply gone. They existed, catalogued and displayed, inside institutions that could in theory be petitioned. In 1936, he opened a formal letter-writing campaign asking European museums to return pieces of the Benin court, requesting a pair of royal stools specifically from the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin. The museum's answer, delivered through diplomatic channels, was to send plaster replicas and keep the originals. Over more than 4 decades on the throne, Akinzua's campaign recovered barely a handful of the thousands of objects taken in 1897, though he did succeed, through personal correspondence with a British officer's descendant, in getting 2 carved ivory pieces sent home in the late 1930s. It was not much. It was also the first time in the 20th century that a Benin monarch had won anything back at all. Akinzua ruled through the most unsettled stretch of Nigerian colonial and early independence history, a period that included the country's transition to self-rule in 1960 and, within a decade, a civil war that killed more than 1 million people, though the fighting itself stayed largely outside Edo territory. Under the new Nigerian constitution, the Oba's position was formally reduced to that of a traditional ruler, a cultural and ceremonial authority with no seat in the federal government, though inside Edo State, the office still commanded a loyalty elected politicians rarely matched. Akinzua sat on regional legislative councils, became chancellor of a Nigerian university, and treated the loss of the bronzes, by most accounts, as a wound that might take generations to close rather than a grievance to settle in his own lifetime. He died in June 1978, at 79, after 45 years on the throne, longer than any Oba since the Old Kingdom fell. Decades before the current wave of returns, the question had already surfaced once, briefly, on an international stage. In January 1977, Nigeria hosted the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, and chose as its symbol an ivory mask carved in the 16th century in the likeness of Idia, the same queen mother whose war strategy had once secured her son's throne. The mask sat in the British Museum, taken in 1897 with everything else. Nigeria asked to borrow it for the festival. The museum refused, citing the object's fragility and the risk of transport, though many in Nigeria read the decision as a simple unwillingness to let go of something considered too valuable to travel, let alone return. Organizers commissioned a replica for the festival's official emblem instead, an image that still appears on Nigerian currency and government seals today, standing in for an original that has never left London. Akinzua's son, Solomon Isio Kuoba Igbinohodua Akenzua, was crowned in March 1979 and took the name Erediawa. He had studied law and administration at King's College, Cambridge, one of the few Obas in the dynasty's history educated in England itself, inside the same institutional world that had once dispatched an expedition to burn his family's palace. Erediawa used that education deliberately, giving interviews to European journalists and corresponding directly with museum directors. Across his 37 years on the throne, he watched the restitution question shift from a private grievance handled through polite diplomatic letters into an international movement with its own momentum, pushed as much by activists and academics outside Nigeria as by the palace itself. Erediawa died in April 2016, at 92. 6 months later, his son, Ehenedin Erediawa, was crowned the 40th Oba and took the name Ewuware II, after the 15th century king who built the walls and first raised the dynasty to prominence. He inherited a campaign nearly 80 years old that had recovered only a handful of objects across 4 reigns. Within less than a decade of his coronation, that would change more than any of his predecessors lived to see. By the early 2020s, researchers working on a project called Digital Benin, an online catalog built by a team of historians and curators in Nigeria, Germany, Kenya, and the United States, had documented more than 5,000 objects taken from the Benin Palace in 1897, held across roughly 130 museums in 20 countries. The British Museum in London held the single largest collection, more than 900 pieces. For over a century, those institutions had treated the question of ownership as settled. That, too, was about to change. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The shift began in Germany. Museums there, among them the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, and the Museum am Rothenbaum in Hamburg, held well over 1,000 looted Benin objects between them, more than almost any other country outside Britain. In 2021, After years of pressure from Nigerian officials and independent researchers who had spent years cataloging exactly which museum held which piece, the German government announced it would return more than 1,100 Benin bronzes held across 20 of its institutions, the largest single restitution commitment any Western country had made over African colonial-era artifacts. Culture Minister Monica Grutters called it a step toward understanding and reconciliation with the descendants of those whose treasures were taken. The following July, Germany and Nigeria signed a formal agreement in Berlin. In December 2022, the first 20 objects were physically handed over in Abuja. In a ceremony German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock attended in person, calling it a long overdue step that would not heal every wound of the colonial past, but showed that Germany was finally taking its history seriously. What happened next exposed a fracture that had been sitting underneath the restitution movement the entire time. Ownership of the Berlin Museum's bronzes was legally transferred to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the nation-state, under the 2022 agreement. Then, in March 2023, days before leaving office, outgoing Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari issued a declaration that the returned bronzes would not go to the Nigerian government at all. They would go directly to the Oba of Benin, Eweka II, described as the rightful custodian and the party responsible for managing wherever the objects were kept. German officials, who believed they had negotiated with a national government committed to public display, were caught off guard. Nigerian federal officials and the government of Edo State, which had spent years planning a large public museum to house the collection, found themselves on uncertain legal ground as well. The palace, for its part, had made its position clear for years. Objects looted from a royal residence belonged to the royal family that had lived there, not to a state government or a federal ministry that did not exist in 1897. That tension has not fully settled. Some returned bronzes now sit in a courtyard display inside the Oba's palace, closed to casual visitors and opened mainly for ceremonial occasions. Others remain in storage while Edo State and the palace negotiate which institution will hold and display them long-term. For most of these negotiations, Edo State was represented by Governor Godwin Obaseki, who held office from 2016 to 2024. Obaseki is a great-grandson of Chief Ago Obaseki, the same official who had administered Benin on Britain's behalf during the 17-year interregnum after Ovonramwen was exiled. More than a century later, a descendant of the man who once ran the kingdom in the Oba's absence was sitting across the negotiating table from the Oba's own descendant, arguing over who now had the standing to decide where the recovered treasury of that same kingdom should live. A planned handover of more than 100 bronzes from Cambridge University's museum was postponed in 2023, amid confusion over exactly who in Nigeria was authorized to receive them. Other institutions kept moving, regardless of the confusion in Abuja. The Horniman Museum in South London returned 72 objects to Nigeria in 2022, and Glasgow's city museums followed with their own holdings soon after, both citing the same argument the palace had been making for decades, that items taken by force from a royal residence carried an ownership claim no auction house purchase could ever clean up. The Smithsonian in Washington drafted the first ethical returns policy in its history in 2022 and began repatriating its own Benin holdings soon after. In February 2025, the Netherlands transferred a group of more than 100 bronzes held at the Wereld Museum in Leiden, one of the largest single returns yet, with most objects designated for the Oba directly, and a handful kept on public display in Lagos. Later that year, the Stanley Museum of Art at the University of Iowa became the first American institution to send objects straight to the royal family, rather than to any Nigerian government body, a decision that drew praise from those who considered it the most historically accurate outcome and criticism from those who worried it bypassed public accountability altogether. By 2023, the Nigerian federal government had formally recognized the Oba's legal claim to the returned bronzes, a move meant to end the dispute with Edo State that has not entirely quieted activists who argue the objects, looted from what functioned as a national treasury, belong to the Edo people collectively rather than to any single office, however old. The British Museum, still the largest holder of Benin material anywhere in the world, has so far declined to return anything permanently, citing a 1963 law that bars it from removing objects from its permanent collection without an act of parliament. Museum leadership has spoken in general terms about long-term loans as a possible workaround, an arrangement that would let the objects travel to Nigeria without the museum ever formally giving up ownership, a proposal the palace has been cool toward, since a loan can in principle be recalled, and a loan is not, in the eyes of a king whose great-great-grandfather watched these same objects carried out of his palace at gunpoint, the same thing as a return. Individual British universities and smaller museums have returned pieces on their own initiative. The National Collection in London has not, and successive governments have shown little appetite for the legislative fight a full restitution would require. In Germany, the returns became politically contested only after they were finished. In 2023, the far-right Alternative for Germany party used a parliamentary debate to accuse the government of naivety, arguing it had handed over priceless cultural property with no conditions attached and no guarantee the works would ever be shown to the public the government claimed to be honoring. Germany's ruling coalition defended the decision, one lawmaker calling any attempt to attach conditions to restitution a version of the same colonial thinking the returns were meant to undo. Eweka II is, by the standards of this story, a rare thing, an Oba who has lived to see real pieces of his family's inheritance come home. Born in 1953, educated at Edo College and later abroad, he spent years working in the Nigerian oil industry and in diplomatic postings before being called back to Benin City to take the throne in 2016. He has married 5 times and has at least 4 children, continuing a pattern of large royal households that has held since Eweka II rebuilt the line a century ago. Unlike the Pahlavis of Iran, scattered by revolution into exile across 3 continents, or the Hohenzollerns of Germany, spending a century negotiating with the state that replaced them over palaces and paintings, the House of Eweka never broke apart in that way. No family member was gunned down on a foreign street. No sibling died alone in a hotel room, mourned by relatives with no country left to bury them in officially. The throne simply passed, generation to generation, inside the same city, on the same palace grounds, interrupted only by the 17 years Ovonramwen spent in Calabar. The throne survived, the treasury did not, and Benin's royal family has spent 4 generations negotiating, pleading, and at times simply waiting for pieces of it to come back one shipment at a time. The museum meant to house the returning collection has become its own source of friction. Plans for a large new institution in Benin City, first proposed in 2019 under the name the Edo Museum of West African Art, and backed by German co-financing and the architect David Ajayi, promised a purpose-built home for the returned bronzes to international curatorial standards. The Oba was never fully behind it. He has said publicly that he wants the bronzes housed in a royal museum connected directly to the palace, under the authority of the crown, rather than inside a state-run institution built with foreign money and a foreign architect, however well-intentioned. The project, since renamed and scaled back, opened in 2025 with a collection that reportedly included clay replicas standing in for bronzes still tied up in the ownership dispute, a detail that embarrassed organizers on both the Nigerian and German sides, and became, for one news cycle, a symbol of exactly how unresolved the larger question remains. Inside Benin City itself, on a narrow road still called Egun Street, brass casters continue a trade passed down inside specific families for over 5 centuries, using the lost wax method their ancestors used to make the very objects Western museums have spent the past several years debating how to return. The street was designated a UNESCO tentative heritage site partly for this reason, a working craft district rather than a preserved ruin, where furnaces still run and apprentices still learn by watching their fathers and uncles pour molten brass into clay molds packed with beeswax patterns. Guild members there tend to view the restitution movement with a mixture of pride and distance. The bronzes matter to them as heritage, as proof their craft once produced work good enough that foreign institutions fought over it for more than a century. But the guild never stopped working. New pieces are cast every year, some for the palace, some for private buyers, some for tourists. Continuing a production line, the 1897 expedition interrupted but did not end. The Igwe festival, the same religious calendar Ovonramwen had tried to protect when he asked Phillips to delay his approach in December 1896, is still observed in Benin City every December, its core structure largely unchanged since before the kingdom fell. Even with the returns of the past several years, most of what was taken in 1897 has not come home. Estimates vary, but the digital Benin catalog puts the number of documented objects still held outside Nigeria in the low thousands, spread across institutions in Britain, the United States, France, Austria, and beyond, many of them small regional museums that acquired a single plaque or ivory carving decades ago and have shown no particular urgency to give it up. Some cite the same legal barriers the British Museum does. Others simply have not been asked. Their holdings buried in storage rooms and old accession ledgers that Nigerian researchers are still working through, object by object, more than a century after the palace burned. The pace of return, after decades of near total silence, has become genuinely unpredictable, sometimes tied more to a particular museum director's politics or a particular government's foreign policy than to any shared international standard. Eweka II's eldest son carries the title Edaiken, the traditional designation for the Crown Prince of Benin, and will in time take the throne under a new regnal name of his own choosing, continuing a system of succession that has outlasted the kingdom that originally produced it, the colonial protectorate that replaced it, and the Nigerian Federation that now contains it. Other members of the extended royal family hold chieftaincy titles inside the palace hierarchy, a structure of ranked councils that has changed very little since Eweka the Great organized it in the 15th century. None of them live in exile. None of them have needed to. What makes this story different from most accounts of fallen monarchies is that it never became a story about a family waiting abroad for a country that no longer wanted them. The Edo people never stopped recognizing their Oba. The palace grounds in Benin City have held a reigning king in close to continuous succession since long before the Portuguese first anchored off the coast, interrupted for less than 2 decades out of roughly 8 centuries. What actually broke in 1897 was something else. A set of objects, a physical record of that continuity, scattered across a world the kingdom had never asked to be part of. Getting that record back, piece by piece, argument by argument, ceremony by ceremony, has taken 4 Obas and more than 100 years, and it still is not finished. Every fresh handover, in Lagos or Berlin or a small gallery in Iowa, reopens the same underlying question the Nigerian government, Edo State, and the palace have never fully settled among themselves. Who, exactly, gets to speak for a kingdom whose government was dissolved a century before the country around it even had a name? Somewhere in a storeroom or a display case in London or Paris, or a small university museum in the American Midwest, sits an object cast by a craftsman working inside the palace walls that James Phillips marched toward in January 1897, certain he would be welcomed. He was not. Neither, in the end, was the empire behind him, though it took the British 1,200 men, several field guns, and a burned city to make that particular point, in a way nobody left standing in Benin could reasonably ignore. The photograph of Ovonramwen on the deck of the SY Ivy still exists today, a reminder of exactly how far the family had to travel before any of what was taken started, slowly and unevenly coming home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.